The corridors smelled like recycled oxygen and old decisions. Councillor Verexone of the Meridian Assembly had walked this particular stretch of pressurized hallway 11,000 times in his career. He knew this because his augmented memory kept an involuntary count of things he wished it wouldn't, and in all those transits, from chamber to archive to chamber again, he had never once felt the particular quality of silence that pressed against him now. It was not empty silence. It was the silence of something that had already happened, of consequences already moving through the universe at the speed of light, outpacing any decision the Assembly might still pretend to make. He was carrying a document that didn't exist yet, in the legal sense. It would be ratified within the hour. Every voting member of the 32 Accord had already signaled consent through their respective relay nodes, and the formal session was little more than theater, the kind the Assembly had elevated to institutional religion. The document was simple in its language, comprehensive in its intent. Effective immediately, no military unit composed of, commanded by, or containing personnel of Terran biological origin would be permitted to operate within Accord-recognized space. No exceptions. No appeals process. No grandfather clauses for units already deployed. Verexone was the one who had written it. He was not proud of this in the way that pride usually functions, as warmth, as satisfaction. He was proud of it the way a surgeon is proud of an amputation, necessary, precise, and something you do not discuss at social gatherings. The humans had been a problem that accumulated rather than announced itself. They hadn't arrived at the galactic stage demanding recognition. They hadn't emerged from their system in warships, or issued manifestos, or built a fleet that made neighboring civilizations recalibrate their threat models. They had come quietly, in the way that all genuinely dangerous things come. Incrementally, with good intentions, asking reasonable questions, and then simply not leaving. 53 years had passed since the first formal contact protocols were completed between the Accord and the Terran Federated Worlds. 53 years was not a long time in Assembly reckoning. Most of the species represented in the Accord measured their political histories in millennia. The Theran had been spacefaring for 6,000 years. The Ashen Collective had maintained unbroken governance structures for 11,000. Even the youngest full member, the Veralan Republics, had been navigating interstellar diplomacy for 800 years before they signed the Accord's founding charter. Humanity had been in space, meaningfully and sustainably, for approximately 220 years. The Assembly had admitted them to observer status largely out of courtesy, which was its own kind of condescension, the polite acknowledgement of a species that was clearly still growing into its eventual shape. It was expected that humans would spend several centuries in that observer status, watching how civilized interstellar governance functioned, absorbing norms, adjusting their more chaotic impulses to the slower rhythms of consensus politics. This was the trajectory every species followed. The Accord was patient. The Accord was always patient. It had learned that patience was the most powerful force in a galaxy where everyone eventually needed something from everyone else. What the Accord had not anticipated, what Verexone himself had not anticipated, despite being considered one of the Assembly's most acute political analysts, was that humanity would simply skip the trajectory entirely. Not through rebellion. Not through aggression. Through a quality that had no precise translation in any of the 41 languages the Assembly operated across. The closest approximation in Verexone's native Meridian dialect was something like useful emergency, the state in which a being does what is necessary in the moment it becomes necessary, without waiting for the appropriate moment to be formally recognized as such. Humans did this constantly, reflexively, at every scale from the personal to the civilizational. When the Keth insurgency fractured the Outer Veil systems 14 years ago, it was human merchant crews, not military, not authorized, operating entirely outside Accord jurisdiction, who began ferrying refugees out of contested corridors before any formal evacuation framework could be assembled. They hadn't asked. There was no protocol for what they did because there was no protocol that anticipated anyone doing something that chaotic and that helpful simultaneously. When the Accord finally convened a formal response committee, 6 months later, humans had already moved approximately 800,000 civilians to stable systems, using routes they had apparently mapped themselves by flying them repeatedly until they were confident the paths were survivable. The Assembly had filed 17 separate regulatory complaints about those operations. The humans had acknowledged each one with what their diplomatic corps described as sincere respect for the Assembly's concerns, and had continued evacuating people. That was the beginning of what Verexone now thought of as the accumulation. Not a single point of conflict but a pattern, building slowly the way sediment builds. Invisible until suddenly the riverbed has changed shape entirely and you are navigating by maps that no longer reflect reality. The military question had become unavoidable 8 years ago, when the Sirith Dominion began its expansion into the Cassadron systems. The Sirith were not Accord members. They were not interested in becoming Accord members. They were interested in the Cassadron resource corridors, in the specific and uncomplicated way that predators are interested in territory. The Accord's response had been measured, graduated, calibrated, all the things that good institutional governance is supposed to be. Formal protest, economic sanction, diplomatic communication through third-party neutral channels. A peacekeeping presence along the corridor borders, composed of mixed-species units under Assembly command, operating under extremely specific rules of engagement that had taken 3 years to negotiate between member states. The Sirith had observed this response and continued their expansion. Humanity had watched the Accord's peacekeeping framework struggle against the Sirith's practiced indifference to graduated pressure, and had done something that still made Verexone's secondary respiratory system tighten when he thought about it. They had volunteered. Not officially. Not through the proper channels. A human officer named Commander Sarah Voss. This was the individual who kept appearing in the reports, the one whose name now lived in Verexone's memory alongside words like complication and precedent, had formally requested that the Terran Federated Worlds be permitted to contribute a combat unit to the Accord peacekeeping force. The request had been denied. Standard procedure. Humans were observers. Observer status nations did not contribute to enforcement operations. There were rules. Voss had submitted the same request 7 times over 14 months, each iteration accompanied by updated tactical analyses of the Sirith expansion rate, revised casualty projections for Cassadron civilian populations if the current peacekeeping approach maintained its present effectiveness, and a section the Accord translators had struggled with, a section that appeared to be a formal argument not for why humans should be allowed to fight, but for why the Accord's current approach was going to fail, presented with the kind of specificity that suggested Voss had been studying Sirith military behavior with a focus that the Accord's own analysts had not matched. The 7th request had been denied with a note suggesting that Commander Voss was to be reminded of observer status limitations and encouraged to redirect her considerable analytical energies toward her government's ongoing Accord membership application, which was proceeding through the appropriate review process on its standard timeline. Verexone had read that note. He had not written it, but he had approved it. This was, he now understood, the first genuinely consequential mistake. He was not yet at his office. He paused in the corridor, one hand resting against the curved wall that looked out through a viewport toward the Assembly Station's orbital ring. The Cassadron star was visible from here as a dim amber point, its systems too far for direct observation but present in his awareness like an old ache. He thought about Voss. She was 41 years old by human reckoning. He had read her file so many times that he had effectively memorized it, not as a bureaucratic exercise but because she had become, over the past 8 years, the lens through which he tried to understand what humans actually were, not what the Accord's classification framework said they were, not what the preliminary contact assessments had suggested, but what they were in the operational sense. What they did when the situation stopped matching the available options. She had served in 3 separate regional conflicts within the Terran Federated Worlds before contact protocols were completed. Her record showed the kinds of things that looked like statistics in a file and refused to become abstract no matter how you framed them. Operations extended past viable parameters, units held together through attrition rates that should have broken command cohesion, decisions made in the field that departed from established doctrine and were later documented as the reason a mission had succeeded rather than failed. One incident investigator had described her approach as systemically non-compliant in ways that are indistinguishable from genius at the outcome level. She had been denied by the Accord 7 times. She had submitted an 8th request 3 months ago. That request was still pending when the Sirith crossed the inner Cassadron threshold, and the peacekeeping force, still operating under its graduated framework, suffered catastrophic losses in the first engagement. She hadn't waited for the response to the 8th request. This was the thing that had forced Verexone's hand, the thing that had made the document he was carrying politically inevitable even to those assembly members who had previously argued for patience and engagement with humanity. Voss had taken her unit, a small one, 43 personnel, detached from a Terran naval vessel that was technically in the region as a surveying ship, which was technically legal under observer status provisions, and she had entered the Cassadron corridor. She had not engaged the Sirith immediately. This was what confused the first round of surveillance reports. The Accord monitoring systems registered the Terran unit moving into the corridor and then doing nothing aggressive for 11 days. They were moving, but not towards Sirith forces. They were moving in patterns that initially looked like reconnaissance and gradually looked like something else, something that required a Theran tactical analyst named Caithmir, the second individual whose name now lived in Verexone's complicated memory, to review 600 hours of positioning data before he could articulate what he was seeing. They were learning the corridor. Not mapping it. The corridor had been mapped for decades. They were learning it the way something learns its own body, with a granularity that only comes from moving through a space repeatedly with the specific purpose of understanding what that space will do to you, what it will do for you, what its geography means when someone is trying to kill you inside it. Caithmir had brought his analysis to the Assembly's emergency session and had said something that Verexone had noted with the careful attention of a person watching something they don't yet understand become something they won't be able to ignore. They are not preparing to fight the Sirith where the Sirith are, Caithmir had said. They are preparing the ground for a fight the Sirith have not yet decided to initiate. The emergency session had voted to issue a formal recall order. On the 12th day, Voss moved. She had 9 ships. The Sirith forces in the corridor numbered 31, plus the support assets they had prepositioned along the inner threshold. By every conventional metric of military analysis, this was not a battle. It was a demonstration of Sirith capacity, of the futility of opposition, of why the Accord's graduated approach was the only realistic option because no military engagement was viable at these odds. Verexone had been in an emergency session when the first engagement data began arriving, and he remembered the initial readings being almost comfortable to interpret, in the grim way of things that confirm your expectations. Terran unit engaging, losses accumulating, standard attrition curve beginning its predictable descent. Then the curve stopped making sense. Caithmir had been pulled into the session as the data became increasingly difficult to interpret through available frameworks. He had stood at the center of the assembly floor. A Theran, which meant he was large and layered and moved with the deliberate quality of a species that had never needed to rush anywhere, and he had worked through the engagement data with the focused stillness of someone actively revising their understanding of a subject they thought they knew well. The 9 Terran ships were not fighting 31 Sirith vessels. They were fighting the corridor. They were using 11 days of granular environmental knowledge to turn the geometry of the space itself into a weapon, drawing Sirith assets into positions where the local stellar interference degraded their targeting systems, retreating along routes they had confirmed were navigable at speeds the Sirith would not risk in unfamiliar space, using their own losses not as failures but as information, adjusting tactics in real time with a flexibility that the Sirith command structure, built for decisive overwhelming force, did not have the architecture to match. By the time the Accord monitoring systems fully processed what was happening, 5 Sirith vessels had been destroyed and the rest were maintaining position rather than advancing. The Sirith commander, a Dominion officer whose tactical record suggested a preference for clean, decisive engagements, had simply stopped. Not retreated. Stopped. Holding position. This, Caithmir explained to the session, was significant in a way that the engagement statistics alone didn't capture. The Sirith had stopped because they did not yet understand what they were fighting, and their doctrine did not include a framework for sustained engagement with an enemy whose behavior resisted predictive modeling. They were waiting for Voss to do something they recognized. Voss had not done anything they recognized. She had instead held her own position for 18 hours, during which time Verexone received a formal communication from her that he had read twice before he trusted his comprehension of it. It was not a battle report. It was a request. Specifically, a request for the Accord's emergency evacuation framework to be activated for the inner Cassadron systems, now that the Cirith advance had been halted, on the grounds that the civilian population was at acute risk and the window for safe evacuation was finite. She was not declaring victory. She was not asking for recognition or permission or ratification of what she had done. She was asking the Accord to use the pause she had created. Verexone had found himself looking at the communication for a long time. He thought about the 8 denied requests. He thought about a word that humans apparently used, not in formal diplomatic communications but in the candid way that things get said when recordings are understood to be running, because humans had a peculiar relationship with the concept of being recorded, approaching it as though surveillance changed very little about how they actually behaved. The word was stubborn. He had seen it used in human self-assessment before. It was typically offered as a mild concession, a humanizing imperfection. He was now reconsidering whether imperfection was the correct frame. What Voss had done was not militarily elegant. 3 of her 9 ships were destroyed. 11 of her 43 personnel were dead. The Cirith had not been defeated. They had been interrupted, which was a different thing, and they would not remain interrupted indefinitely. She had not won a war. She had made a specific thing possible inside a specific window of time, at a specific cost, and she had made it possible by being more willing than the Cirith to absorb the process of figuring out how, by committing so completely to an outcome that the cost of achieving it became secondary to the fact of achieving it. This was what Verexone could not translate. Not the tactics. Not the technical specifics of corridor fighting or electromagnetic interference patterns. The part he could not translate was the internal condition that made those tactics possible. The state of being in which the gap between what was available to you and what you needed to accomplish was not a limitation but simply a problem that had not yet been solved, which meant the next thing you did was begin solving it regardless of what the available options formally suggested. The Accord had activated the evacuation framework. 230,000 Cassadron civilians were moved from the inner systems over the following 3 weeks. The Cirith, facing an enemy they had not successfully predicted and an Accord that had suddenly demonstrated more operational coherence than their strategic models anticipated, withdrew to their previous positions and entered formal negotiations for the first time in 8 years of expansion. The Assembly had held 17 sessions in the month following the corridor engagement. The document Verexone carried was the result of those sessions. It was correct, he believed, or had believed, in the way you believe things before the moment when your own argument reveals its assumptions. Humanity could not be permitted to operate as an unsanctioned military force within Accord space. The precedent was too dangerous. The accountability gaps were too severe. If human units could engage in armed conflict without Accord authorization and the result was strategically beneficial, then the Accord's entire framework for managing conflict, the graduated responses, the coalition structures, the negotiated rules of engagement that took years to produce and represented genuine achievement in interstellar governance, became something humans could simply bypass whenever they calculated that bypassing it would produce better outcomes than waiting for it. This was an accurate analysis. Verexone still believed it was accurate. He also understood, standing in the corridor with the document in his hand, why it was too late. It was not too late in the military sense. The Cirith had withdrawn. No active engagement was occurring. The prohibition could be enforced in the sense that the Accord had monitoring capacity and political leverage and formal mechanisms for sanctioning member governments, and humanity was not yet a full member but wanted to be, which meant leverage existed. It was too late in a different sense, a sense that was harder to codify but that Verexone was accustomed to working with, because 30 years in assembly politics had made him fluent in the grammar of irreversibility. The Cassadron populations knew what had happened. Not the Assembly's version, carefully framed in institutional language about unauthorized operations and regulatory violations. The actual version. 230,000 people had been told, in many cases by the human personnel who loaded them onto transports, that the corridor was being held by 43 individuals in 9 ships because someone had decided that waiting for proper authorization was less important than the fact that they were still alive to require it. This information was now part of the lived understanding of multiple civilizations within the Accord sphere. It would not become less true because the assembly passed a document. The Cirith knew something too. They had fought. If fought was the right word for the interrupted advance that had not resolved into clear engagement, something that did not perform according to their military doctrine's predictions, and they had made the decision to stop rather than escalate. This was not a decision driven by weakness. It was a decision driven by a quality Verexone recognized because the assembly relied on it constantly. The calculation that uncertain costs are more dangerous than certain limitations. The Cirith didn't know what continuing would cost. And the source of that uncertainty was not the Accord's peacekeeping force, with its rules of engagement and its graduated framework. It was 43 humans in 9 ships who had spent 11 days learning a corridor well enough to make it dangerous. This information was also now part of the strategic landscape. It would not become less true. Caithmir had come to Verexone privately, 2 days before the final vote on the document. He had not come to argue against it. Caithmir was a tactical analyst, not a politician, and he had no formal stake in assembly resolutions. He had come because he had found something in his continued review of the corridor engagement that he felt Verexone should understand. Verexone had listened. In the particular way, he listened when something important was being said carefully. Caithmir had identified the moment when the Cirith commander stopped advancing. He had pulled the precise data point, a 17-second interval in the engagement record, and run it against every available strategic model for Cirith decision-making. What he found was that the Cirith commander had stopped not because the tactical calculus changed. The numbers still favored the Cirith, even with their losses. She had stopped because in a 12-second window, one of Voss's ships, heavily damaged, weapons systems offline, operating on emergency propulsion, had performed a maneuver that brought it into direct collision course with the Cirith flagship. The ship had not continued that course. It had pivoted, somehow. Caithmir had watched the telemetry repeatedly and could not entirely explain how, given the propulsion status, and survived. But the Cirith commander had seen a disabled ship point itself at her flagship like an intention, and she had made the calculation that a force which would consider that option, even momentarily, was a force whose behavior existed outside the boundaries of what strategic modeling could reliably contain. She couldn't predict them, Caithmir had said quietly, in the particular flat tone he used when he was being precise rather than expressive. Not because their tactics were superior, because she couldn't identify the point at which they would decide something was worth dying for. In Cirith doctrine, that point is fixed. It's definable. It's factored into every engagement model they run. With Voss's unit, she could not locate that point. And without it, the model breaks. Verexone had said nothing. He had thought about the 8 denied requests. He had thought about the 11th day of learning a corridor. He had thought about the formal communication asking the Accord to use the pause, written from the middle of an active engagement, with 3 ships destroyed and 11 personnel dead. The document would pass. He would continue to believe it was correct. And it would accomplish, he now understood, the following. It would tell humanity that their manner of being in the galaxy was prohibited by the institutions that governed that galaxy. It would tell them this after they had already demonstrated what their manner of being in the galaxy could produce. It would tell them this while 230,000 Cassadron people were resettling in stable systems, and while the Cirith sat in their previous positions having withdrawn from an 8-year expansion because 43 humans had made the cost of continuing incalculable. The Terran Federated Worlds membership application was still moving through the review process on its standard timeline. Verexone walked the final length of corridor to his office, sat down, and placed the document on his desk. Outside his viewport, the Assembly's orbital ring turned slowly against the backdrop of the settled galaxy, all those civilizations, all those millennia of negotiated coexistence, all that accumulated patience. He thought about Voss's file, about the phrase that had appeared in the incident investigation, systemically non-compliant in ways that are indistinguishable from genius at the outcome level. He thought about what it meant that humanity had been denied 7 times and had submitted an 8th request. What it meant that the 8th request was still pending when they moved. What it meant that they had moved not in anger, not in defiance, but with 11 days of careful preparation and a request ready to send at the first viable pause. He thought about the kind of species that waits for the right moment and, when the right moment does not arrive, creates it. He signed the document. He sat with it signed for a long time, and he thought about what he knew about humans. Not what the files said, not what the contact assessments had suggested, not what the Accord's classification frameworks had established. What he had learned. He thought about the fact that they were, by every biological metric, a young species. That they had been spacefaring for 2 centuries. That they had been asking for a seat at these particular tables for 53 years and had been given observer status and a standard timeline membership review. He thought about what it meant that they had produced Sarah Voss in that context. Not in a context of power, not with the backing of a 1,000-year strategic tradition, not with institutional frameworks and coalition structures and rules of engagement negotiated over decades. In the context of being told, repeatedly, through appropriate channels, that the right moment had not yet been formally identified. The document was correct. The prohibition was necessary. The precedent was real and the accountability gaps were severe, and the Accord's governance framework was genuinely important and worth protecting. And somewhere in the Casadron corridor, or more likely already somewhere else, because Voss's file did not suggest a person who remained where she had already been, there was a human officer who had submitted 8 requests, received 7 denials, and acted on the 8th before the response arrived, because she had calculated that the response was not the point. The Accord had existed for 6,000 years. It had managed, with genuine skill and genuine dedication, to construct a framework in which a galaxy full of species with competing interests and diverging values could coexist without destroying each other. This was not a small thing. Verexone believed this completely, and he believed the document on his desk was consistent with that legacy. He also believed, in the careful and private way of a person whose job was to accurately understand things whether or not that understanding was useful, that the galaxy had just encountered something it had not previously had to account for. A species in its infancy that could not be predicted, not because it was chaotic, but because the fixed point in its decision-making, the place where a Sirith commander could find the boundary and build her model, simply wasn't where anyone expected it to. It wasn't capability. It wasn't technology. It wasn't numbers or resources or the accumulated weight of institutional history. It was somewhere past all of that, in a place that had no precise translation in 41 languages, where the question of whether something was possible had already been set aside, and the only remaining question was what it would cost, and the answer to that question was always, apparently, whatever it takes. The document would be ratified within the hour. The prohibition would stand. And humanity would look at that prohibition and, Verexone suspected, do exactly what they had always done with limitations they respected but could not afford. They would find the 8th request.